There's a moment that happens every year. And if you're the kind of person this video is about, you know exactly what it feels like. Someone walks up to you with a warm smile and says the words, "Happy birthday." And you smile back, genuinely, warmly, and you say thank you. It's just another day. And you mean it. Or at least, part of you means it. But somewhere underneath that calm, underneath that practiced ease, there's something else happening. Something you've probably never fully examined. Something that lives so quietly inside you that you've mistaken it for personality, for preference, for simply being the kind of person who doesn't make a big deal out of things. But here's what most people miss when they look at someone who doesn't celebrate their own birthday. They assume indifference. They assume low maintenance. They assume that person just doesn't care about parties or attention or being the center of anything. And maybe that's even what you've told yourself, that you're just not that kind of person, that birthdays are commercialized anyway, that you're above the need for celebration. What if that's not the whole story? What if the psychology behind not celebrating your own birthday is one of the most revealing windows into how you learned to exist in the world, into how you learned to take up space, or more precisely, how you learned not to. This isn't a video about people who are too cool for birthdays. This is a video about people who, somewhere along the way, learned that their existence didn't need to be announced, that their presence didn't warrant celebration, that asking for attention, even on the one day that culturally belongs entirely to you, felt like too much, felt dangerous, felt like setting yourself up for something that would hurt. And if that resonates, I want you to stay with me, because what we're about to explore together isn't just interesting psychology. It's the kind of understanding that might give you language for something you've carried for a very long time without knowing what to call it. Let's start with something that sounds simple, but isn't. The birthday is one of the only cultural rituals we have that is entirely, unapologetically, about one individual person. Not about what they've achieved, not about what role they play in a family or a community. Just about the fact that they exist, that they were born, that the world is different because they're in it. Every other celebration has a reason attached to it. A graduation, a wedding, a promotion. You're being celebrated for something you did. But a birthday is different. A birthday says you deserve to be celebrated simply for being here. And for some people, that premise is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Not because they're humble, not because they're selfless, but because something inside them, something learned very early and reinforced very consistently, doesn't believe it's true. Think about what it would mean to fully receive a birthday, to let people make a fuss over you, to allow yourself to be the center of attention for a day, to say yes to the dinner, yes to the cake, yes to the singing, yes to being seen. For many people, that kind of receiving feels almost physically uncomfortable. There's a tightening, a wanting to deflect, a compulsion to redirect the attention back outward, to say, oh, it's really not a big deal, to minimize, to shrink, to make it smaller than it is. Psychologists have a term for the difficulty in receiving care, in allowing yourself to be the object of positive attention and celebration. It's sometimes called discomfort with receptivity, and it shows up across many domains of life, not just birthdays. People who struggle with it often have trouble accepting compliments. They deflect praise. They feel guilty when someone does something kind for them. They feel the need to immediately reciprocate or explain why they don't deserve it. And on their birthday, all of these tendencies converge into one quiet, practiced phrase. It's just another day. But where does this come from? Why would someone learn to be uncomfortable with their own celebration? The answer, for many people, lives in their earliest experiences of what attention felt like. Because attention is not a neutral thing, we learn very early whether attention is safe, whether being seen is something that leads to warmth or to pain, whether making yourself visible brings connection or criticism. And those early lessons become the invisible architecture of how we move through the world for the rest of our lives. For some people who don't celebrate their birthdays, the story begins with inconsistency. Birthdays that were sometimes celebrated and sometimes forgotten. Years where something was made of the day and years where it passed in silence. When you grow up in an environment where you can't predict whether your existence will be acknowledged, something happens in the nervous system. You stop anticipating. You stop building up. You stop allowing yourself to want, because wanting and not receiving is a particular kind of pain that the mind learns to protect itself against. Psychologists call this learned low expectation, and it's one of the most quietly devastating adaptations a person can make. Because on the surface, it looks like equanimity. It looks like someone who isn't attached to outcomes, who doesn't need things to be a certain way. But underneath, it's a protective mechanism. If you don't expect the celebration, you can't be hurt when it doesn't come. If you tell yourself it's just another day, you don't have to feel the weight of a day that passed without anyone making you feel like you mattered. And here's the painful irony. The very protection that kept you from being hurt also kept you from being loved in the way you needed. Because when you consistently signal that you don't need celebration, that you're fine with being overlooked, that it really doesn't matter, the people around you take you at your word. They stop trying. And then the silence that you created to protect yourself becomes the evidence your nervous system uses to confirm what it already believed. That you're not the kind of person who gets celebrated. That your existence isn't the kind that warrants a fuss. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is a human mind doing exactly what human minds do, adapting to the environment it finds itself in, creating strategies that make sense given the information it has. And if the information you received early in life was that your needs were inconsistent, that your presence was sometimes welcomed and sometimes ignored, that making too big a deal of yourself led to disappointment or even criticism, then learning to keep your birthday quiet was the most logical thing you could have done. But you're not that child anymore. And the strategies that protected you then may be costing you something now. If this is landing for you, Take a second to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the other conversations like this one. There's another layer to this, and it's one that's less often talked about. Some people don't celebrate their birthdays, not because they're protecting themselves from disappointment, but because they genuinely feel uncomfortable being the object of focused, positive attention. This is different from low self-worth, though it can overlap with it. This is more specifically about the experience of being seen. For people who grew up in environments where visibility was dangerous, where drawing attention to yourself led to criticism, to jealousy, to punishment, or to the burden of being made responsible for other people's emotions, staying invisible became a survival strategy. You learned to move quietly through the world, to not take up too much space, to not make too much noise, to not need too much. And a birthday, with its inherent demand that you be seen, that you stand at the center, that you accept the gaze of the people around you, feels like a violation of the very rules that kept you safe. This is sometimes connected to what family systems theorists call the parentified child dynamic, or what trauma therapists describe as hypervigilance to others' needs. If you grew up in a household where you were attuned to the emotional states of the adults around you, where your job was to manage the room rather than to exist freely within it, then being celebrated feels almost backwards. Celebration is for the people who are allowed to be the main character. And somewhere along the way, you decided or were taught that you were not that person. And so birthdays became something to get through rather than something to inhabit, something to manage rather than something to receive. You learned to be gracious and deflecting all at once, to smile and say thank you and redirect the energy back outward as quickly as possible. Because the longer the attention stays on you, the more exposed you feel. And exposure, for someone whose early experiences taught them that being seen wasn't safe, feels like standing in the middle of a room with no walls. There's also something that deserves its own space in this conversation, and that's the relationship between birthday avoidance and what psychologists call existential confrontation. Because for some people, it's not primarily about self-worth or visibility or fear of disappointment. It's about what a birthday represents. Another year, time moving, life being measured, the gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be. Birthdays have a way of holding up a mirror, and if what you see in that mirror doesn't match what you hoped for, if you're not where you wanted to be at this age, if the life you're living doesn't feel like the life you imagined, then the birthday becomes less of a celebration and more of an accounting, a reckoning, a moment where you're forced to confront the distance between your expectations and your reality. And for people who are carrying that kind of quiet grief, the idea of throwing a party, of making the day festive and bright, can feel almost cruel, like being asked to celebrate the very thing you're mourning. So you keep it quiet, you let it pass, you tell yourself it's just another day, because that's easier than sitting with the weight of what the day actually brings up. This is what some existential psychologists call birthday depression or birthday blues, and it's far more common than the culture acknowledges. The cultural script around birthdays is celebratory. You're supposed to feel happy, grateful, festive. And if you don't, if the day brings up something more complicated, something heavier, something that doesn't fit neatly into the celebration narrative, there's often nowhere to put that, no language for it, no permission to feel it. So you opt out. You say it's just another day, and in doing so, you protect yourself from having to explain why the day that's supposed to be the most about you is also the day you feel most invisible. I'm curious about something, and I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Was there a specific birthday, a particular year, where you first remember deciding it was easier not to want anything from the day? What was happening in your life then? Because I think that moment holds more than we realize. And I think someone else reading the comments right now needs to know they're not the only one who made that quiet decision. If this is your experience, I want to say something directly to you. The feelings that birthdays bring up for you are not wrong. They are not a sign that something is broken in you. They are a sign that you are a person with a rich, complex inner life, and that you carry things that deserve to be witnessed. The quiet grief of a year that didn't go as planned is real. The discomfort of being seen is real. The protective strategy of keeping your expectations low is real. All of it is real. All of it makes sense. And all of it deserves compassion, not performance. Now let's talk about something that lives very close to all of this. The relationship between birthday avoidance and self-worth. Because at the heart of many of these patterns, whether it's the fear of disappointment, the discomfort with visibility, the existential confrontation, there is often a quieter, more fundamental belief. A belief that your existence is not quite worthy of celebration. That while other people deserve to be fussed over, to be made much of, to be the center of something warm and joyful, you are not quite in that category. This belief rarely announces itself. It doesn't walk up to you and say, "Hello, I'm your core wound." It lives in the background. It expresses itself through the deflections, the minimizations, the practiced casualness about your own birthday. It shows up in the way you find it easier to celebrate others than to receive celebration yourself. In the way you feel a kind of relief when your birthday passes quietly, even as some small part of you aches for something more. Psychologists who work in the area of self-worth and internal validation make an important distinction between two kinds of self-regard. There's contingent self-worth, which is self-worth that depends on external feedback, on achievement, on recognition, on being seen and approved of. And there's unconditional self-worth, which is a stable sense of value that doesn't rise and fall based on what's happening around you. People often assume that those who don't celebrate their birthdays have strong, unconditional self-worth, that they're so secure in themselves that they don't need the external validation of a party or a cake or a chorus of happy birthday. And sometimes that's true. There are people who have genuinely internalized a stable sense of their own worth, who don't need the celebration because they already know they matter. But for many people who quietly skip their birthday, the psychology is actually the opposite. It's not that they're so secure they don't need it. It's that they've learned not to want what they don't believe they deserve. And those two things look identical from the outside. The person who doesn't celebrate because they're genuinely content, and the person who doesn't celebrate because they've given up on being celebrated, they both smile and say, "It's just another day." But the internal experience is profoundly different. And here's the truth that's hardest to sit with. If you've spent years telling yourself that you don't care about your birthday, that it doesn't matter, that you're above all that, it might be worth asking yourself whether that's genuine preference or whether it's a story you've told so many times you've started to believe it. Because the mind is extraordinarily good at turning its protective strategies into identities, at making the things we do to survive feel like the things we simply are. You might have started not celebrating your birthday as a way to protect yourself from disappointment. And somewhere along the way, not celebrating became who you are. The person who doesn't make a big deal of birthdays, the low-maintenance one, the one who doesn't need all that. And now, the strategy has become a self-concept, and questioning it feels like questioning yourself. But you are allowed to question it. You are allowed to look at the patterns you've built around this one day and ask whether they're serving you or simply protecting a wound that deserves to be healed rather than hidden. There's something else worth exploring here, and it's the social dimension of birthday avoidance. Because not celebrating your own birthday doesn't just affect you. It affects the people around you who love you and want to show it. And there's a particular dynamic that can develop in relationships when one person consistently signals that they don't want or need to be celebrated. The people who love you want to celebrate you. They want to make you feel special. They want to have a reason to show you how much you matter to them. And when you consistently deflect that, when you minimize the day, when you make it smaller and quieter and more ordinary than they want it to be, you're not just protecting yourself, you're also, in a subtle way, preventing them from loving you in the way they want to. This is one of the less visible costs of the keep it low-key birthday strategy. It creates a kind of intimacy barrier, a wall of self-sufficiency that keeps people at a comfortable distance. And while that distance feels safe, it also keeps you from experiencing one of the most nourishing things human connection can offer, which is the experience of being celebrated, of having someone look at you and say, "Your existence matters to me. I'm glad you're here. The world is better because you're in it. You deserve that. Not because you've earned it, not because you've achieved enough or been good enough or shown up enough, but because you're a person, because you exist, because the fact of your presence in the world is, in itself, something worth marking." And I know that might be hard to hear. I know that for some of you, reading or hearing those words creates a kind of internal resistance. A voice that says, "That's not really true," or "That's for other people," or "You don't know what you're talking about." That voice is the wound talking. That voice is the learned belief that your existence is not quite worthy of being celebrated. And it's been speaking so long and so quietly that it's become indistinguishable from your own inner voice. But it is not the truth about you. It is a story you inherited, and stories can be rewritten. Let's talk about what it might look like to begin doing that. Not in a dramatic, overhaul your entire relationship with birthdays kind of way, but in a gentle, curious, what-if kind of way. What if this year you let yourself want something for your birthday? Not a party if parties feel like too much. Not a big production if that's genuinely not your style. But something that acknowledges that the day is different from other days. Something that says to yourself, even quietly, even privately, that you're glad you're here. What if you let one person in? One person who loves you and wants to celebrate you. What if instead of deflecting, you said yes? Yes to the dinner. Yes to the cake. Yes to being the one who is cared for. Just for today. Not because you need it. Not because you're performing gratitude. But because receiving care is a skill. And like all skills, it gets easier with practice. What if you let yourself sit with the day instead of moving through it as quickly as possible? Not to confront all the things that didn't go as planned, not to do the accounting, but just to be present with the fact of your existence, to notice that you are here, that you have survived another year, that the fact of your continued presence is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Because here's what I want you to understand. The people who don't celebrate their birthdays are often the people who are most attuned to others, who remember everyone else's birthdays and go out of their way to make them feel special, who show up for the people they love in consistent, quiet, generous ways, who give freely and deflect when it's their turn to receive. And if that's you, I want to ask you something. If you showed up for a friend the way you show up for the people you love, and on their birthday they said, "It's just another day, let's not make a big deal of it," how would that feel? Would you accept that? Or would you want to push back a little? Would you want to say, "But you matter to me"? Would you want to find a way to make them feel seen, even if they were uncomfortable with it? That impulse you feel toward the people you love, that desire to make them feel celebrated, to mark the day of their existence as meaningful, that impulse is correct. It's pointing at something true. Existence deserves to be celebrated. Being here deserves to be marked. And that truth applies to you just as much as it applies to anyone you've ever celebrated. You are not the exception to your own wisdom. There's a particular kind of person who ends up in this pattern, and I want to describe them carefully because I think many of you will recognize yourself in this description. They are often deeply empathetic. They are often the ones who hold space for others, who listen well, who notice when someone is struggling before that person has said a word. They are often the ones who give more than they receive, not because they're martyrs, but because giving feels safe and receiving feels vulnerable. They often have a rich inner life that the people around them only partially see. They are often more complex than they appear. They often carry more than they show. And they have often learned, somewhere along the way, that their complexity, their depth, their needs are a burden rather than a gift. They are not a burden, they are a gift. The depth of feeling, the attunement to others, the capacity for empathy and care. These are extraordinary things to carry, and they deserve to be in a world that celebrates them, not just tolerates them, not just appreciates them when they're being useful, but celebrates them simply for existing. If you are this person, I want to say something to you that you may not have heard enough. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be the center of something warm. You are allowed to let people love you in the big, visible, celebratory ways that you so readily offer to others. You are allowed to want your birthday to mean something. You are allowed to let it mean something. You are allowed to be celebrated, not because you've earned it, not because you've finally done enough, or been enough, or proven enough, but because you are here, because you exist, because the world is genuinely different, because you're in it, even if no one has ever said that to you in a way you could fully receive. And I know that receiving that, even as words on a screen or a voice through headphones, might feel uncomfortable, might activate that familiar impulse to deflect, to minimize, to say, "Oh, that's a nice thing to say, but it's not really about me." Notice that impulse, be curious about it, and then gently see if you can let the words land anyway. Because the work of healing the wound that lives underneath birthday avoidance is not about forcing yourself to throw parties or perform enthusiasm you don't feel. It's about slowly, gently, practice by practice, learning that you are worth celebrating, that your existence is not something to be apologized for or minimized or quietly moved past, that you are a person who deserves to be seen, to be marked, to be celebrated, simply for being here. That is the work, and it is quiet work. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the small moments when you catch yourself deflecting and pause to ask whether you really want to deflect or whether you're just doing what you've always done. It happens when you let someone do something kind for you without immediately trying to even the score. It happens when you say yes to the dinner, or the cake, or the phone call, or even just the acknowledgement, and you let yourself feel it instead of moving past it as quickly as possible. It happens when you look at the day of your birth, and instead of saying, "It's just another day," you allow yourself to think, even quietly, even privately, that it is not just another day, that it is the day you arrived, that it is the day the world became different because you were in it, and that is worth something, that you are worth something, not because of what you do, not because of how useful you are, not because of how well you manage yourself, or how little you ask for, or how graciously you deflect, but because of who you are, because of the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable person that you are. You are not too much. You are not enough. You are not a burden for having needs or a bother for wanting to be seen. You are a human being navigating a world that often fails to celebrate the people who most deserve it. and you deserve better than the silence you've learned to accept. So this year, whatever your birthday looks like, whether it's a quiet dinner with one person or a small gathering, or just a moment alone where you let yourself acknowledge the day, I want to invite you to try something. Try receiving it. Whatever form it comes in, however small or large, try letting it land. Try not deflecting quite as quickly. Try sitting in the discomfort of being seen just a little longer than usual. Not because you owe anyone a performance of gratitude, not because you have to suddenly become a birthday person, but because the practice of letting yourself be celebrated is, at its core, the practice of believing that you matter. And you do. You genuinely do. And if this video found you today, if something in these words touched something in you that you haven't been able to name before, I want you to know that that recognition, that feeling of being seen, that moment of your experience being described in words that finally fit, that is not an accident. That is you finding language for something real. And language for our experience is one of the most powerful tools we have. Because when we can name what we carry, we can begin to set it down. You are not broken for not celebrating your birthday. You are not cold or indifferent or above it all. You are someone who learned in very understandable ways to protect yourself from a particular kind of pain. And that protection served you. It kept you safe when you needed to be safe. But you are not in that place anymore. And you deserve to live in a world and to build a life where you don't have to protect yourself from being loved. Where you can let the celebration in. Where you can stand in the center of something warm and joyful and let yourself belong there. Not because you've earned it, but because you always did. If someone in your life quietly skips their birthday every year, if you know someone who always says it's just another day and you've always sensed there was more underneath that, share this video with them. Not to fix them, not to pressure them into celebrating, but to give them language for something they may have been carrying alone for a very long time. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer someone is the feeling that their experience has been seen and named, that they are not the only one, that what they feel makes sense. That is what this video can be for someone who needs it. If this video helped you feel seen today, I hope you'll stay. There are more conversations like this one here. Explorations of the quiet patterns we carry, the invisible wounds we navigate, the complex psychological landscapes that shape who we are and how we move through the world. Subscribe if you want more of that. And if you feel safe, share your story in the comments. Tell us what your birthday means to you, or what it's meant to avoid. Because someone out there is reading the comments right now, wondering if they're the only one who feels this way. And your voice might be exactly what they need to feel a little less alone. Thank you for watching. And if the pattern we explored today, that deep pull towards self-erasure, that discomfort with being fully seen and received, feels like something that runs even deeper in you, the video on the psychology of the child who raised themselves speaks directly to where so much of this begins. the moment a child learns that their needs come last, and what that costs them for decades to come.